He never imagined that stepping onto French soil would be the last time he'd write to his mother. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Private James Morrison, 22 years old, from a small farm in Kansas, clutched a worn envelope in his pocket as bullets whistled overhead on Omaha Beach. The letter inside, written the night before, would become one of the most haunting artifacts of World War II. "Dear Mother," it began, "by the time you read this, I'll either be celebrating victory or resting in God's arms." Those words, discovered decades later in military archives, reveal a truth about war that history books often miss. James Morrison wasn't a decorated general. He wasn't a strategic mastermind. He was simply a son who loved his mother, caught in the greatest military operation in human history. The morning mist hung heavy over the English Channel as 156,000 Allied troops prepared for the invasion. James sat in the crowded landing craft, surrounded by men who would never see another sunrise. Some prayed, some vomited from seasickness and fear. James wrote. His handwriting, preserved in faded ink, shows the tremor of the boat, the shake of his hands. But the words remain clear, powerful, human. "I want you to know that I'm not afraid," he wrote, "not because I'm brave, but because I carry your love with me like armor." Military historians would later confirm that James's unit, the 29th Infantry Division, suffered catastrophic losses that morning. Of the 200 men in his company, only 18 survived the first hour. But James Morrison's story isn't just about death. It's about what we choose to say when words might be our last. It's about love transcending the chaos of war. In the archives of the National World War II Museum, his letter sits among thousands of others. Each one a universe of emotion. Each one a final testament. But James's letter stands out for one extraordinary reason. He wrote two versions that night, one for if he lived, one for if he died. The second letter, the one his mother received 3 weeks later, along with a telegram from the War Department, would change how an entire town understood sacrifice. As the landing craft approached the blood-soaked sand of Omaha Beach, James folded both letters carefully. He gave the first to his best friend, Corporal David Chen, with simple instructions. "If I make it, burn this. If I don't, make sure she gets it." What James Morrison wrote in that final letter would inspire a movement that continues to this day. But to understand its power, we must first understand the boy who became a soldier, and the mother who raised him to face the impossible. Dorothy Morrison was 43 years old when she kissed her only son goodbye at the train station in Topeka. The year was 1943. The war had already claimed the lives of 3 boys from their farming community. She pressed a small Bible into James's hands, the same one her father had carried through the fields during the Great Depression. "Come back to me," she whispered. James promised he would, but promises in wartime are fragile things, easily shattered by artillery shells and machine gun fire. James had volunteered the day after Pearl Harbor, like millions of other young Americans. He wasn't running toward glory, he was running toward duty. His father had died when James was 12, leaving him to help his mother maintain their 160-acre wheat farm. Every sunrise, every harvest, every struggle had prepared him for hardship, but nothing prepares a farm boy for war. In his letters home during training, James described the transformation. "They're turning us from farmers into fighters," he wrote. "But at night, when the lights go out, we're all just boys missing home." His bunkmate was a Jewish kid from Brooklyn who had never seen a cow. Another was a Mexican-American from Texas who taught James phrases in Spanish. David Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco, became his closest friend despite the fact that Chen's family was facing discrimination back home while their son prepared to die for America. This was the beautiful contradiction of the American military in World War II. Boys who might never have spoken on the street became brothers in the barracks. Dorothy kept every letter in a wooden box beside her bed. She read them by candlelight when the Kansas storms knocked out the power. She memorized passages. She traced his handwriting with weathered fingers. The neighbors would see her in the fields, working alone, always alone, waiting for the mail truck to rumble down the dusty road. The last letter she received before D-Day was dated May 30th, 1944. "We're shipping out soon," James wrote. "I can't say where, but everyone knows something big is coming. The officers are nervous. That's how you know it's real." He told her about the English countryside, how it reminded him of home but greener, older somehow. He described the bombed churches, the children who had learned to sleep through air raid sirens, the way tea could make anything bearable. But between the lines, Dorothy read what he couldn't write. Her boy was scared. "I've been thinking about that summer when I was 8, James continued. "When the drought nearly killed our wheat, you made me believe rain would come. You were right." "You're always right, Mother. So I'm choosing to believe you're right about this too. That I'll come home." What Dorothy didn't know was that James had already written his final letter. That May night, in a tent somewhere in southern England, surrounded by 10,000 other boys preparing for history's greatest gamble, James Morrison put pen to paper one last time. The words he chose would echo through generations. They would be read at memorials, studied by historians, and whispered by mothers who understood too well the weight of sacrifice. But first, they had to survive D-Day. The night before D-Day, chaos disguised itself as order. Massive staging areas across southern England buzzed with controlled panic. Officers checked equipment for the 100th time. Chaplains moved through the ranks offering last rites to boys who suddenly remembered how to pray, and in a corner of a crowded tent, Private James Morrison wrote by the light of a dying flashlight. "Dear Mother," the final letter began. "If you're reading this, then I've broken my promise to come home. Please forgive me." Outside, the sound of aircraft engines filled the darkness. Thousands of paratroopers were already boarding planes, the vanguard of the invasion. James paused his writing to help David Chen adjust his equipment. Chen's hands were shaking too badly to manage the straps. They didn't speak. What was there to say? The letter continued in spurts, whenever James could steal a moment. He wrote about the farm, about the old oak tree where he'd carved his initials, about the way morning light looked on the wheat fields in July. Simple things, eternal things, the things soldiers think about when death feels close enough to touch. "I want you to know that I understood what I was fighting for," he wrote. "Not for glory or medals or because I hate the enemy. I'm fighting so that other mothers' sons can grow old, so that children I'll never meet can play in fields without fear, so that the world you taught me to love might survive this darkness." Around him, other soldiers wrote their own letters. Some couldn't find words and simply stared at blank paper. Others wrote furiously, trying to compress a lifetime of love into a few paragraphs. The tent smelled of gun oil, cigarette smoke, and fear sweat. Someone was crying quietly in the corner. No one judged. Tomorrow they would need to be steel. Tonight, they were allowed to be human. James Morrison had seen combat before D-Day. He'd survived the brutal fighting in Sicily, where the summer heat competed with German artillery to see which could kill you first. He'd lost friends in Italy, watched them disappear in clouds of smoke and screaming, but D-Day felt different. The scale of it, the weight of it. Everyone knew this was the moment that would decide the war. "I've made friends here, Mother. Good men from places you've never heard of, fighting for people they'll never meet. If heaven is real, I hope it's full of soldiers. Not because we're warriors, but because we understand sacrifice." The letter grew more urgent as the night wore on. Orders would come soon. There were things that needed to be said while there was still time. James wrote about forgiveness for the German boys they would face tomorrow, most of them no different from himself. He wrote about gratitude for 22 years of life, for Kansas sunsets, for a mother's love that followed him across an ocean. But the most powerful passage came near the end. The words that would later be carved into monuments and quoted by presidents. The words that transformed a private's letter into a universal testament. "Don't let my death make you bitter, Mother. Don't let it steal your faith in goodness. I've seen terrible things in this war, but I've also seen men share their last piece of bread, carry wounded enemies to safety, die with prayers for home on their lips. Humans are capable of such darkness, but also such light. Choose light. Always choose light." As dawn approached on June 6, 1944, James Morrison sealed both letters. The first one, full of hope and plans for after the war, went into his breast pocket. The second one, the one you've been reading, he entrusted to David Chen. History would determine which letter survived. 4:30 in the morning, June 6, 1944. The English Channel churned with gray violence, tossing landing crafts like toys. James Morrison vomited over the side, along with half his unit. The breakfast they'd forced down, steak and eggs, the traditional last meal, came up mixed with seawater and terror. Even the veterans were sick. The channel seemed to know what was coming and raged against it. Through the spray and the darkness, James could see the outline of hundreds of ships, the greatest armada ever assembled. But in that small landing craft, pressed between 35 other boys, the war shrunk to the few feet of wet steel around him. David Chen was on his left, reciting something in Chinese, prayers his grandmother had taught him. On his right, a kid from Alabama clutched a photograph of his newborn daughter, a baby he'd never met. The naval bombardment began as they approached the coast. The sound was beyond description, like God himself was tearing the sky apart. Explosions lit the horizon in hellish orange blooms. Someone said it was beautiful. Someone else told him to shut up. 30 minutes! The coxswain's voice cut through the noise. 30 minutes until they hit the beach. James felt the letters in his pockets. One in the breast pocket over his heart. One in his waterproof pouch. His hands moved automatically, checking his rifle, his ammunition, his equipment. Training took over when the mind wanted to flee. But then the plan began to unravel. The naval bombardment, massive as it was, had missed most of the German positions. The aerial assault had dropped their bombs too far inland. The tanks that were supposed to lead them in had mostly sunk in the rough seas. And the current, no one had properly accounted for the current. They were heading for the wrong section of beach. "This isn't right," David Chen said, his voice steady despite everything. He was looking at the cliffs, comparing them to the sand table models they'd studied. "We're too far east." He was right. Instead of landing at their designated sector, they were heading straight into the killing fields of German machine gun nests that should have been someone else's problem. The first landing craft hit the beach at 6:30 a.m. James watched from 1,000 yards out as the ramps dropped and men rushed forward into a wall of lead. They fell in heaps at the water's edge. Some made it a few yards before the machine guns found them. The water turned red. "Oh God," someone whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." There was no time for fear now. No time for anything but the terrible momentum of the assault. Their landing craft lurched toward the beach, toward the systematic slaughter. James gripped his rifle until his knuckles went white. Beside him, David Chen had stopped praying. His face had become a mask of determination. The boat scraped sand. The ramp began to drop. And in that moment, that eternal second before stepping into history, James Morrison did something remarkable. He pulled the hopeful letter from his breast pocket, the one meant for if he survived, and pressed it into David Chen's hand alongside the other one. "Both," he said simply. "Give her both." Chen didn't have time to respond. The ramp slammed down. The machine guns were already searching for them, bullets sparking off the steel. There was nowhere to go but forward. Go, go, go. And James Morrison, farm boy from Kansas, ran into the scream of German steel on Omaha Beach. What happened in the next 6 minutes would determine which letter his mother would receive. But more than that, it would reveal the true cost of freedom. Paid in young men's blood on a beach 6,000 miles from home. The moment James Morrison's boots hit the water, time fractured. What historians would later describe in neat paragraphs became a chaos of sensory overload. The water was colder than expected, shocking his system. Deeper, too. Weapons and equipment meant for dry land became anchors, dragging men under. To his left, a soldier from his unit simply vanished beneath the waves, pulled down by 80 pounds of gear. Machine gun fire turned the air into a living thing, full of wasps made of lead. The sound wasn't what movies would later portray. Not a steady rattle, but a terrible ripping like God tearing canvas. Men fell mid-stride. They spun and collapsed and screamed and died, and still the living pushed forward because there was nowhere else to go. James made it to the beach. That alone was a miracle. The sand offered no protection. It was too soft to run on, too exposed to survive on. German 88mm artillery had zeroed in on the landing zones. Shells burst among the struggling men, throwing bodies and parts of bodies into the gray morning sky. A medic near James simply ceased to exist, replaced by red mist. "The seawall!" someone was screaming. "Make for the seawall!" 200 yards. It might as well have been 200 miles. But men were moving, crawling, running in short bursts. James saw David Chen 20 yards to his right, dragging a wounded soldier whose legs weren't working anymore. Always the helper, even in hell. What happened next would be disputed by historians but confirmed by 3 survivors. James Morrison, watching Chen struggle with the wounded man, made a decision that would define the rest of his very short life. He broke from his own path to safety and ran toward his friend. In war, heroism often looks like stupidity. Running across open sand under heavy machine gun fire to help another man was tactically insane. But James wasn't thinking tactics. He was thinking about a promise made in training, blood brothers who swore to watch each other's backs. He almost made it. The German MG-42 that killed James Morrison was positioned in a concrete bunker 400 yards up the bluff. Its crew had been killing Americans for 20 minutes with mechanical efficiency. They would later be captured and interrogated. One of them, a 19-year-old from Bavaria, would spend the rest of his life haunted by that morning. James took 3 rounds in the chest. The impact spun him around, and for a moment he stayed on his feet, looking surprised. Then his knees buckled. He fell facing the sea, toward home, toward Kansas, toward a mother who was at that very moment making breakfast and listening to the radio for news. David Chen saw him fall. Despite the wounded man he was dragging, despite the death all around, Chen changed direction. He crawled those 20 yards through sand made muddy with blood. He reached James as the light was already fading from his eyes. "The letters," James whispered. Blood frothed on his lips. "Tell her." He never finished. Private James Morrison died at 6:47 a.m. on June 6, 1944. One of approximately 2,400 Americans who fell on D-Day. He was 22 years old. He had been on French soil for exactly 17 minutes. David Chen would survive Omaha Beach. Against all odds, he would drag that wounded soldier to safety, earn a Silver Star, and fight all the way to Germany. He would come home to San Francisco, marry his childhood sweetheart, and name his first son James. And he would keep his promise about the letters. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, we need to understand what happened when Dorothy Morrison opened her door to find a Western Union telegram boy standing on her porch, his face already telling her what the yellow paper would confirm. Dorothy Morrison knew before she opened the telegram. Mothers always know. She'd felt it 3 weeks earlier, a cold sensation that woke her at 4:47 in the morning, Kansas time. She'd sat up in bed, hand pressed to her chest, James's name on her lips. Later, when the official records were converted to Central Time, she would realize her son had died at that exact moment. "We regret to inform you," the words blurred. The telegram boy, no more than 16 himself, stood awkwardly on the porch. He'd delivered 3 such telegrams that day. By war's end, he would deliver 47. Each one aged him a little more. Dorothy didn't cry. Not then. She thanked the boy, closed the door, and walked to the kitchen. She made coffee. She sat at the same table where she'd taught James to read, where they'd shared 10,000 meals, where he'd told her he was enlisting. The house felt different now, emptier. As if it knew its purpose had changed from home to memorial. The neighbors came, of course. It was 1944, rural Kansas. Grief was communal. Women brought casseroles. Men stood awkwardly in the parlor, hat in hand, remembering the boy who'd helped with their harvests. The pastor came to pray. The American Legion representative came with paperwork. Dorothy moved through it all like a ghost, present but not really there. Then, 2 weeks after the telegram, David Chen appeared at her door. He was still in uniform, on leave before shipping back to Europe. He'd taken 3 trains and hitchhiked the last 20 miles. When Dorothy opened the door, they stood looking at each other. The mother who'd lost a son and the soldier who'd watched him die. Chen was crying before he could speak. "Mrs. Morrison," he managed. "I'm David, James's friend." She pulled him into the house, into the kitchen, into the chair where James used to sit. And there, over coffee that grew cold between them, David Chen told her everything. The friendship, the beach, the final moments. He was honest in the way that only those who've seen death can be honest. "He died trying to help," Chen said. "That's who he was, even at the end." Then he pulled out the letters, both of them, the hopeful one and the final one. His hands shook as he placed them on the table. Dorothy stared at them for a long moment, understanding what they represented. Hope and resignation, future and ending, the beautiful and terrible duality of war. She read the hopeful letter first. In it, James talked about coming home, about expanding the farm, about maybe going to college on the GI Bill. He wanted to study agriculture, to learn new methods to make the land more productive. He wrote about a girl from the next county he'd been thinking about, wondering if she'd waited. He planned to finally fix the barn roof that had leaked since his father died. It was almost too painful to read this vision of a future that would never be. Then she opened the final letter, the one you've been hearing, and as she read her son's last words, something shifted in Dorothy Morrison. The grief didn't leave. It would never leave, but it transformed, became something else, something with purpose. Choose light, she read aloud. Always choose light. David Chen would later say that watching Dorothy Morrison read her son's final letter was like watching a resurrection, not of the body, but of the spirit. The broken woman who'd answered the door became something else, someone with a mission. "Mr. Chen," she said when she finished reading, "David, you were with my boy at the end. That makes you family now, and family helps family. Tell me, what do you need?" It was such an unexpected question that Chen couldn't answer at first. Here was a woman who'd lost everything, asking what she could do for him. But Dorothy Morrison had understood something fundamental from her son's letter. Grief could be a prison or a doorway. She was choosing the door. What Dorothy Morrison did next would transform a small Kansas farming community and eventually ripple across the nation. She published James's final letter in the local newspaper, not for sympathy or attention, but because she believed his words belonged to more than just her. The editor, a World War I veteran himself, wept as he typeset the words. "I've seen terrible things in this war, but I've also seen men share their last piece of bread." Within days, the letter was reprinted in papers across Kansas, then Missouri, then nationwide. Mothers who had received their own telegrams wrote to Dorothy. Fathers who had lost sons found comfort in James's words about sacrifice having meaning. A grieving nation discovered that a farm boy from Kansas had articulated something profound about human nature in the midst of mechanized slaughter. But Dorothy didn't stop with publication. She established the James Morrison Memorial Fund with her son's $10,000 military life insurance payment. Its purpose was simple but revolutionary for 1944, to help returning veterans of all races and backgrounds get education and start businesses. Remember, this was before the Civil Rights era. Segregation was still law, but Dorothy Morrison, inspired by her son's friendship with David Chen and his letters about the brotherhood of soldiers, insisted the fund be open to all. "My son didn't die for some Americans," she told the town council when they questioned her decision. "He died for all Americans." The first recipient was a black soldier from the 761st Tank Battalion who wanted to open a mechanic shop. The second was a Mexican-American veteran who needed help buying farmland. The third was David Chen himself, who used the funds to attend medical school. By 1950, the fund had helped over 200 veterans start new lives, but the letter's influence extended beyond Kansas. Military chaplains began reading it to troops. Gold Star mothers formed groups around its message of choosing light over darkness. In 1952, President Truman quoted from it in a speech about the meaning of sacrifice. "Private Morrison understood what we sometimes forget," Truman said, "that democracy is renewed not through hatred of enemies, but through love of humanity." Hollywood wanted to make a movie. Publishers wanted Dorothy to write a book. She refused all offers. "This isn't about fame," she said. "It's about keeping faith with the dead." Instead, she continued working her farm, hosting veterans who needed a place to heal, and responding personally to every letter she received from grieving families. One of those letters came from an unexpected source, the mother of Heinrich Müller, the German machine gunner who had killed James. She had gotten Dorothy's address from David Chen, who had met Müller during the occupation and learned of his deep remorse. The German mother's letter, written in broken English, asked for forgiveness for her son's actions. Dorothy's response would become almost as famous as James's original letter. "There is nothing to forgive," she wrote. "Your son and mine were both boys caught in history's machinery. I choose to believe they would have been friends in a different world. Perhaps in the next world, they are." This exchange led to something remarkable. Dorothy Morrison and Gertrude Müller began a correspondence that lasted 20 years. They shared recipes, photographs, and grief. When Gertrude's husband died, Dorothy sent condolences. When Dorothy broke her hip during harvest, Gertrude sent money to help hire workers. Two mothers who should have been enemies became friends, proving James's words about choosing light. The impact continued to grow. Schools began teaching the letter in history classes. Veterans organizations adopted "Choose Light" as an unofficial motto. When the civil rights movement began, several leaders cited James Morrison's letter about the brotherhood of soldiers as evidence that integration was not just possible, but necessary. By 1964, 20 years after D-Day, Dorothy Morrison had become an unlikely national figure. She testified before Congress about veterans' affairs. She spoke at Memorial Day ceremonies. She turned her farm into a retreat center for veterans struggling with what would later be called PTSD. And always, she ended her speeches with her son's words, "Choose light, always choose light." The true test of James Morrison's philosophy came not in the immediate aftermath of war, but in the decades that followed. As America struggled with Korea, Vietnam, and social upheaval, his letter became a touchstone for those trying to make sense of sacrifice and loss. Dorothy Morrison, now in her 70s, found herself counseling a new generation of grieving mothers. In 1968, at the height of Vietnam War protests, something extraordinary happened. A young soldier named Michael Thompson was killed in the Tet Offensive. His mother, bitter and angry, had joined the anti-war movement. She wrote to Dorothy Morrison challenging her, "How can you still believe in choosing light when boys keep dying for nothing?" Dorothy invited her to Kansas. For 3 days, the two women, one who had lost a son in the good war, another who had lost a son in the controversial one, talked, cried, and searched for meaning. What emerged from their conversation would reshape how America thought about military sacrifice. Together they wrote what became known as the Two Mothers Declaration. It stated that one could honor the soldier while questioning the war, that patriotism didn't require blind acceptance, and that choosing light meant working for peace while respecting those who served. The document was read into the congressional record and helped bridge the growing divide between war supporters and protesters. But it was in personal moments that James's letter had its most profound impact. David Chen, now Dr. Chen, established free clinics in California's poorest neighborhoods. When asked why he devoted his life to serving others, he would pull out a worn copy of James's letter. "Because a Kansas farm boy died saving my life," he'd say, "and he told me to choose light." The ripples continued. A veteran who had attempted suicide read the letter in a VA hospital and decided to live. He went on to become a counselor, saving dozens of other veterans from the same darkness. A teacher in inner-city Detroit used the letter to help gang members understand that strength could mean choosing peace over violence. A priest in Northern Ireland read it during the Troubles, bringing together Catholic and Protestant families who had lost children to sectarian violence. By 1984, 40 years after D-Day, historians estimated that James Morrison's letter had been read by over 10 million people worldwide. It had been translated into 15 languages. Nelson Mandela quoted it during South Africa's transition from apartheid. Solidarity leaders in Poland passed it hand-to-hand in underground meetings. Even in the Soviet Union, samizdat copies circulated among dissidents who saw in a American farm boy's words a universal truth about human dignity. Dorothy Morrison lived to see all of this. She died in 1987 at the age of 87, still on the farm where she had raised her son. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans, politicians, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by James's words. David Chen gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he described watching his friend die on Omaha Beach and the decades of light that had followed. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from Heinrich Müller, the German soldier who had fired the fatal shots. Now a grandfather and peace activist, he had flown from Germany to attend. At the graveside, he placed a small stone he had carried from Omaha Beach. "For James," he said simply, "and for choosing light." The Morrison farm was converted into a memorial and retreat center. Veterans still come to walk the fields, to sit under the oak tree where James carved his initials, to find peace in the Kansas wheat. The original letters are displayed in a simple frame in the farmhouse kitchen, next to the table where a young soldier once learned to read and write. But the story doesn't end with Dorothy's death. Because every war produces new James Morrisons, new mothers reading telegrams, new choices between light and darkness. The letter's relevance has only grown in an age of endless conflict and digital division. When hatred seems easier than understanding, when darkness feels overwhelming, a farm boy's dying words remind us that we always have a choice. In 2019, 75 years after D-Day, a remarkable discovery was made. A French farmer plowing a field near Omaha Beach unearthed a corroded ammunition box. Inside, wrapped in waterproof canvas, was a collection of personal effects from American soldiers. Among them was a third letter from James Morrison, one that Dorothy never received, one that David Chen never knew existed. This letter, apparently written in the landing craft during the crossing, was different from the others. Shakier handwriting betrayed the boat's movement and perhaps the writer's fear. It was addressed not to his mother, but to the German soldier I might kill today. "Dear enemy," it began, "by the time this day ends, one of us might be dead by the other's hand. I want you to know that I don't hate you. I hate what your leaders have done, the evil they've unleashed, but not you. You're probably young like me, scared like me, missing home like me." The letter went on to describe his farm, his mother, his dreams for after the war. He wondered if the German soldier had similar dreams. He wrote about David Chen and how friendship had taught him that supposed enemies could become brothers. He ended with a passage that military ethicists now study. "If I kill you today, I'll carry it forever. If you kill me, I hope you won't let it poison your life. We're both victims of forces beyond our control, but we're also human beings with choices. After this war ends, choose to be better than the hatred that brought us here. Build instead of destroy. Love instead of hate. That's the only victory that matters." The discovery made international headlines. The letter was authenticated, and DNA testing confirmed it was James's handwriting. But more importantly, it sparked a global conversation about enemies and humanity, about how we see those we're told to fight. In Germany, Heinrich Müller, now 94 and one of the last surviving D-Day veterans, read the letter with tears streaming down his face. "He forgave me before I even pulled the trigger," he whispered. His granddaughter posted his reaction online and it went viral. An old German soldier weeping over words from the American boy he'd killed, proving that redemption has no expiration date. The letter inspired a new generation of peace initiatives. Veterans from opposing sides of conflicts began meeting, sharing stories, finding common ground. A program called Letters to My Enemy encouraged soldiers and civilians in conflict zones to write to those on the other side, humanizing the dehumanized. In Afghanistan, an American Marine and a former Taliban fighter, both missing legs from the same battle, met at a rehabilitation center. They had read James Morrison's third letter. Slowly, painfully, they became friends. They now travel together, speaking about reconciliation. "If a dead farm boy from Kansas could forgive his killer before it happened," the Marine says, "then we who survived can certainly try." But perhaps the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. In 2020, during the global pandemic when the world felt more divided than ever, a nurse in New York City was treating COVID patients. Exhausted, overwhelmed, watching people die alone, she nearly quit. Then a colleague shared James Morrison's letters. She printed all three and taped them to her locker. Every day before entering the COVID ward, she would read, "Choose light, always choose light." She wasn't alone. Medical workers worldwide began sharing the letters, finding in a World War II soldier's words the strength to face a different kind of war. The letters took on new meaning in an age of social media vitriol and political polarization. When keyboard warriors unleashed hatred, people would respond with James's words about seeing humanity in enemies. When despair felt overwhelming, his mother's fund, still operating after 75 years, reminded people that grief could become generosity. Schools began teaching all three letters as a unit, showing how one person's choice to see humanity in others could ripple across decades. Students from Kansas made pilgrimages to Omaha Beach, leaving wheat from the Morrison farm on the sand. French students visited Kansas, bringing sand from the beach to mix with the soil where James grew up. The story came full circle in 2024, 80 years after D-Day. The last surviving members of James's unit gathered at Omaha Beach. Only 3 remained, all over 100 years old. David Chen's son brought his father, now confined to a wheelchair but mentally sharp. They stood where James had fallen, where boys had become history. Dr. Chen spoke slowly, his voice carrying across the now peaceful beach. "James Morrison saved my life twice. Once when he died trying to reach me. Again, when his words taught me how to live." He pulled out the original letters, still carried after 8 decades. He was wrong about one thing. He wrote that he wasn't brave, but choosing light in the middle of darkness, that's the bravest thing anyone can do. Here's what war takes: futures, possibilities, the infinite potential of young lives cut short. James Morrison would never marry that girl from the next county, never fix the barn roof, never see his wheat fields again. He would never hold his children, never grow old, never sit on the porch telling stories about the war. 22 years was all he got. But here's what one person's choice can create: a legacy that outlives centuries, words that heal across generations, light that persists through any darkness. Today, if you visit the American cemetery at Normandy, you'll find James Morrison's grave among 9,187 others. A simple white cross marks where he rests, facing west toward home. Visitors often leave wheat stalks, a Kansas tradition that has spread worldwide. But his true memorial isn't in marble or monuments. It's in every act of kindness chosen over cruelty, every hand extended across divides, every decision to build rather than destroy. The Morrison family farm still stands, now a place where veterans find peace and purpose. The original oak tree where James carved his initials has grown massive, its branches sheltering meditation benches where soldiers from many wars sit in silence. The wheat still grows, descended from the same seeds Dorothy planted while waiting for her son to come home. In the farmhouse, thousands of letters fill filing cabinets. Testimonies from people whose lives were changed by a soldier's dying words. A suicide prevented here, a reconciliation achieved there. Enemies who became friends, darkness that gave way to light. Each letter proves that James Morrison's death, while tragic, was not meaningless. His mother was right to publish that letter, right to insist that grief could become grace, right to believe that her farm boy's words belonged to the world, because in the end, James Morrison's story isn't about war, it's about what we do with the time we have, how we treat each other in our darkest moments, and why choosing light matters even when, especially when, the darkness seems overwhelming. You might wonder why this story matters now, 8 decades later. Look around. Division, hatred, the dehumanization of others, these poisons haven't disappeared. They've just taken new forms, but so has the cure. Every time someone chooses understanding over judgment, every time former enemies become friends, every time light wins over darkness, James Morrison's sacrifice gains new meaning. His third letter, the one to his unknown enemy, contained a line that historians consider prophetic. Long after this beach is cleaned of blood, long after the scars heal and cities are rebuilt, people will still face the same choice: to multiply pain or to end it, to pass on hatred or to break its chain. He was right. That choice confronts us daily in ways small and large, in how we treat the stranger, the immigrant, the person who votes differently, in whether we amplify anger on social media or seek common ground, in whether we teach our children to fear differences or to find humanity in everyone. The last surviving witness to James Morrison's death, David Chen, passed away in 2021 at age 99. His final public words spoken to a gathering of young military recruits were these: "I've lived long enough to see enemies become allies, to watch hatred give way to friendship, to witness the world James dreamed of taking shape. It didn't happen through force or victory. It happened one choice at a time, one person at a time, choosing light." But perhaps the most powerful testament to James Morrison's legacy comes from an unexpected source. In 2023, researchers using AI to analyze wartime correspondence discovered something remarkable. James's phrase, "choose light," appeared in over 50,000 letters from World War II veterans to their families, soldiers who had heard about or read his letter and adopted its message as their own. His words had become a quiet revolution, spreading heart to heart, letter to letter. Today, as new conflicts arise and old hatreds resurface, as technology connects us while ideology divides us, a farm boy's message feels more urgent than ever, not because it's complex or revolutionary, but because it's simple and true. In our darkest moments, we can choose light. In the face of hatred, we can choose love. When confronted with enemies, we can choose to see human beings. James Morrison never made it off Omaha Beach, but his words traveled further than any soldier's boots could march. They crossed oceans, transcended languages, outlived wars. They spoke to concentration camp survivors and their liberators, to protesters and police, to anyone who has ever stood at the crossroads between hatred and humanity. There's a tradition now at the Morrison farm. Every June 6th, at 6:47 a.m., the moment James died, people gather in the wheat field. Veterans and civilians, Americans and Germans, people of all faiths and none. As the sun rises over the Kansas plains, they read his letters aloud. All three of them. Then they stand in silence, watching the light spread across the land he loved. It's a simple ceremony, but in that silence, something profound happens. People who came as strangers leave as friends. Old grudges soften, new understanding blooms. The choice James Morrison made in his last moments, to run toward a friend in need rather than away from danger, continues to inspire others to run toward reconciliation rather than revenge. This is how the dead speak to the living. Not through seances or superstition, but through the words they leave behind and the choices those words inspire. Every veteran who uses the Morrison Fund to build a business creates jobs and hope. Every person who reads his letter and chooses kindness over cruelty extends his life. Every former enemy who becomes a friend proves that his death was not in vain. War will come again. It always does. Young men and women will face impossible choices on distant beaches and in foreign fields. Some will not come home. But as long as James Morrison's words survive, as long as people remember that even in humanity's darkest machinery we can choose to be light, then something precious endures. So here's what a Kansas farm boy wants you to know, speaking across 8 decades from a beach in France. You have more power than you think. Every day, in ways small and large, you choose between adding to the world's darkness or its light. Choose light, not because it's easy. It isn't. Not because it always wins. It doesn't. But because in the end, it's the only choice that honors the sacrifice of those who died believing the world could be better. The wheat grows, the sun rises, and somewhere, someone is reading an old letter from a young soldier, finding in his words the courage to forgive, to hope, to try again. This is James Morrison's true memorial. Not a stone in France, but a living legacy of choices made and hearts changed. Thank you for joining me in remembering Private James Morrison and the thousands like him who gave their tomorrows for our todays. If this story moved you, please share it. Like and subscribe to this channel where we believe history lives not in dusty books but in the choices we make today. Comment below. How will you choose light in your life? What would you write if you knew they were your last words? And remember, every time you choose understanding over hatred, every time you reach across a divide, every time you see an enemy as a human being, you prove that a farm boy from Kansas didn't die for nothing. Choose light. Always choose.